One of the things that's important in any age is to be able to discern truth and error. Been talking through 2 Peter. 2 Peter chapter 2 says this in the first verse. It says, "But false teachers also arose among the people, just as there will be false teachers among you, who will secretly bring in destructive heresies, even denying the master who bought them, bringing upon themselves swift destruction." How would you recognize a false teacher? You know, it's important because there are messages all around us, and people are pushing this and promoting this and saying this is the way and this is what you ought to do. How do you sort through it? Well, one thing that is very important in discerning false teachers is this. If you can determine what is false teaching, then it's much easier to know whether you're dealing with someone that is a false teacher, either by motive or by design or just from the content of what they say. Maybe they are being misled or deceived themselves. The scriptures say in John 7:17, if anyone is willing to do the will of God, he will know of the teaching, whether it be from God. And that's Jesus speaking. And so if we want to understand what false teaching is, a great place to begin is that something that you're willing to receive? Do you have the kind of heart that is willing to receive the truth if God communicates it to you? Now, to rightly divide the truth is a very important skill, a very important thing to be able to discern. And first of all, we must understand that the scriptures are truth without error. They come from God. 1 Corinthians 2 tells us that the deep things of God are taught to us by the Spirit of God. So we must look to God's word as authoritative, be willing to receive it. As we seek to understand God's word, we need to bow our heads in prayer and humbly ask God to be our teacher. We need to ask God's Spirit to be our guide, to be our teacher, to help us. And then, as God has chosen to reveal himself in literature, in what we call the scriptures, God's word, then we must learn to look at the scriptures as God has chosen to reveal them to us. And so in looking at the scriptures, there's one thing that we say from the outset. We say that the context is king. And that means that you can't just take a word or a phrase and pull it out of the scriptures and run with it with a disregard for the context in which it was written. The same thing holds true for any kind of literature. But in looking at the scriptures and seeking to understand them, to interpret them rightly, we must look before and after the passage that we're looking at. Consider the scriptures as a whole. We must look at the scriptures as literature as they're written. We look at the individual aspects of it. We look at the words. We look at the punctuation. We look at whether there is repetition, whether there is contrast, whether there is a progression of ideas, whether this is taught in other places in the Bible, which generally things are. So we look before and we look after and we look at the pieces, and then from what we observe, we put together our observations to come to a conclusion of the author's intent. Excuse me. And when we come to the author's intent, then we come to the application. We come to, well, it meant this in their town. What does it mean in our town? And how am I to implement this into my life? For the scriptures are not written just for our information, but for our transformation. But the scriptures become truly dynamic in our life and truly transforming when we live in light of the truth in which we've been given. So, false teachers, hey, step one is to understand what false teaching is. And next Wednesday night, God willing, as we gather in our Bible study, 6 p.m., First Baptist Church, Clarksville, we're going to talk about how some of these false teachers present themselves, some descriptions of them, not just from 2 Peter chapter 2, but throughout the scriptures. And we will understand some of their fruits, some of their objectives, and how we might be forewarned that we might live lives that are pleasing to God. Thank you. May God bless you this week. Be safe in what is the projected storm.